The scorching sun beat down mercilessly as Della Turner's blood soaked into the desert sand, her breath coming in ragged gasps while vultures circled overhead, patiently waiting for her final surrender to the vast emptiness of the Arizona Territory, 1878. 3 days earlier, Della had been filled with hope. At 24 years old, she'd finally saved enough money from her job as a schoolteacher in Silver City to purchase passage on a stagecoach bound for Tucson. Her brother had written of opportunity there, of land, and a fresh start away from the painful memories that haunted her in New Mexico. The future stretched before her like an open road. "You'll want to keep that parasol handy, miss," the stagecoach driver had advised as he helped her aboard. "Sun out here can cook a person faster than a skillet." Della had smiled politely, adjusting her modest blue traveling dress and tucking a stray honey blonde curl beneath her bonnet. She'd been raised in mining towns her whole life and knew the desert's dangers well enough. The other passengers, a portly businessman, a young married couple, and a thin man with darting eyes who'd introduced himself as Mr. Pierce, barely acknowledged her as she took her seat. The first day of travel had passed uneventfully, with overnight accommodations at a way station that, while rustic, had been tolerable. It was the second day when everything changed. Whoa there. The driver's shout had jerked Della from her half-sleep as the stagecoach lurched to a violent stop. She'd glimpsed the driver's body falling from his perch, a bloom of red spreading across his shirt before gunfire erupted all around them. Nobody move. A masked man had appeared at the door, pistol drawn. "This is a robbery, valuables in the bag and nobody gets hurt." The businessman had been the first to comply, emptying his pockets with trembling hands. The married couple followed suit, the woman sobbing quietly as her husband surrendered their wedding bands. When the bag reached Della, she dropped in her meager savings $32 that had taken her 3 years to accumulate. "That all you got, pretty lady?" The outlaw had leaned in closer, his breath sour with whiskey. "Don't seem like much." "It's everything I have," Della had whispered, shrinking back from his gaze. Then, to everyone's shock, Mr. Pierce had drawn a hidden derringer. "That's enough," he'd shouted, but before he could fire, the outlaw's partner had shot him through the window. Chaos erupted as the passengers screamed and the outlaws dragged them from the coach. "What do we do with them, Rance?" one outlaw had asked. The leader, Rance, had considered them with cold eyes. "No witnesses." Della had watched in horror as the businessman and the married couple were executed with brutal efficiency. When Rance turned to her, something in his expression changed. "This one might be worth something else," he'd said, reaching for her arm. In that moment, survival instinct had taken over. Della had kicked him hard and bolted, running blindly into the desert as bullets kicked up dust at her heels. A searing pain had erupted in her side. One of the shots had found its mark, but terror drove her onward, until she could no longer hear the men's shouts. Now, 3 days later, Della lay dying. The bullet wound in her side had stopped bleeding, but infection was setting in. She had no water, no food, and the meager shade of a stunted mesquite tree was all that stood between her and the relentless sun. Her cracked lips formed silent prayers as darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. "Not like this," she whispered to the empty desert. "Please, not like this." As consciousness slipped away, Della thought she heard hoofbeats in the distance. A hallucination. Surely the desert's final cruelty before death claimed her. 50 miles away, in the small settlement of Wyatt, Arizona Territory, Deacon Xavier straightened from examining tracks in the hard-packed earth. At 32, he'd spent more than half his life reading signs that most men would overlook. A displaced stone, bent grasses, the faint impression of a boot heel. These particular tracks told a grim story, one of pursuit and desperate flight. "What you find?" Sheriff Holden asked, squinting against the sun as he sat atop his horse. "Stage was hit here," Deacon said, his voice low and rough from years of desert dust. 4 passengers based on the tracks, drivers dead over there." He nodded toward a mound of stones they'd piled over the man's body earlier. "Looks like they killed 3 passengers, but 1 ran." He pointed to smaller footprints leading away from the stagecoach. "Woman, I reckon. She's wounded. How can you tell?" Deacon's weathered face remained impassive as he pointed to dark stains on the ground. Blood trail, start steady, gets spotty as she ran. He stood, adjusting the worn leather hat that shaded his eyes. She headed east, into the Perdition Flats. Sheriff Holden shook his head. Poor soul. Nobody survives out there, especially wounded. She might. Deacon's jaw tightened as he walked to his horse, a dun-colored Mustang that stood patiently in the shade of the abandoned stagecoach. I'm going after her. Deacon, it's been 3 days since that stage was due. Even if she made it out there, she's gone by now. Then I'll bring back her body for proper burial. Deacon checked his saddlebags, which contained water canteens, jerky, and medical supplies. Nobody deserves to be left for the vultures. The sheriff sighed, knowing there was no dissuading the tracker once his mind was set. The outlaws headed west toward the dragoons. Jenkins and Parker rode out yesterday to track them. You sure you don't want to join that hunt instead? Those bastards killed 4 people. Deacon swung into the saddle with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback. You've got men after the killers. That woman's got no one. With a nod to the sheriff, he turned his horse eastward and set off at a steady trot, scanning the ground for sign. The woman's trail was faint, but readable to his experienced eyes. A displaced stone here, a broken twig there. Deacon had earned his reputation as the territory's best tracker, honestly, through years of hunting both men and game across Arizona's harshest landscapes. The son of a cavalry officer and a Mexican mother, Deacon had learned tracking from Apache scouts during his father's postings. After his parents died of fever when he was 17, he'd made his own way, working as a scout for the Army, then as a bounty hunter before settling in Wyatt 5 years ago. He now ran a small ranch outside town and occasionally helped the sheriff when his tracking skills were needed. As the sun began to set, Deacon made camp in a shallow arroyo. He built a small fire, ate a sparse meal of jerky and hardtack, and studied the stars while planning tomorrow's route. The woman had been heading deeper into Perdition Flats, 80,000 acres of the most unforgiving desert in the territory. Without water, she wouldn't have lasted long, yet something about her trail bothered him. She hadn't wandered aimlessly as most lost travelers did. She'd maintained a relatively straight course eastward, suggesting she either knew where she was going or was simply too determined to falter. Dawn found Deacon already in the saddle, following the increasingly faint trail. By midday, the signs had nearly disappeared in the hard, rocky ground. He dismounted frequently, kneeling to study minuscule disturbances in the earth. Twice he lost the trail completely, circling wider and wider until he found it again. It was late afternoon when he spotted the buzzards. 3 of them circled lazily in the distance, their dark forms stark against the blue sky. Deacon's heart sank, but he urged his horse forward. As he approached, he saw a crumpled form beneath a scraggly mesquite tree. The buzzards scattered at his approach, reluctantly abandoning their anticipated meal. Dismounting quickly, Deacon approached the still figure. It was indeed a woman, her blue dress torn and dust-covered, her blonde hair fallen loose from its pins. She lay on her side, one arm outstretched toward the east as if still trying to crawl forward even as consciousness fled. Kneeling beside her, Deacon gently turned her onto her back. Her face was badly sunburned, lips cracked and bleeding, but even through the reddened skin and trail dust, he could see she'd been beautiful. Was still beautiful if his fingers sought the pulse point at her throat and found it faint and thready but present. "Madam." He shook her shoulder gently. "Madam, can you hear me?" No response. Quickly, Deacon examined her for injuries and found the bullet wound in her side. It had stopped bleeding but was inflamed and hot to the touch, infection setting in. He pulled a canteen from his saddlebag and carefully wet his bandana, then pressed it to her parched lips. "Come on now," he murmured. "Just a little." After a moment, her throat moved reflexively, swallowing the precious moisture. Encouraged, he continued, allowing tiny amounts of water to trickle into her mouth until she began to stir. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of the sky after a summer storm. "Am I dead?" she whispered, her voice a painful rasp. "Not yet, madam," Deacon replied, his usual gruffness softening. "Found you just in time, I reckon. Confusion clouded her features. Who? Name's Deacon Xavier. I'm from Wyatt. Sheriff sent me to find survivors from the stagecoach robbery. He offered more water, which she drank eagerly. Easy now. Too much at once will make you sick. Della's mind struggled to process what was happening. After days of solitude and the certainty of death, this man's appearance seemed impossible. Was he a mirage? But mirages didn't offer water that cool and real on her tongue. Della, she managed. Della Turner. Miss Turner, Deacon nodded. You've got a bullet wound that needs tending and you're suffering from heatstroke and dehydration. I need to get you back to town, but you're in no condition to ride today. We'll camp here tonight. Without waiting for a response, he set about making camp, unrolling his bedroll beneath the meager shade of the mesquite and collecting enough brush to build a small fire for the night. From his saddlebags, he produced a small pot into which he poured water and added dried meat and a handful of beans. It won't taste like much, he said as he set the pot to heat, but you need something in your stomach. Della watched him through half-lidded eyes, still not entirely convinced he was real. He moved with quiet efficiency, his tall frame lean and muscular beneath a dust-covered buckskin jacket and faded denim trousers. His face was all hard planes and angles beneath several days' worth of stubble, but his hands were surprisingly gentle as he tended to her wound, cleaning it with whiskey from his flask and bandaging it with strips of clean cloth. Why? She finally asked as he helped her sit up enough to sip the broth he'd prepared. Why what? Why did you come looking for me? The sheriff said everyone must be dead. Deacon's dark eyes met hers briefly before looking away. Nobody deserves to die alone out here. But how did you find me? I must have been miles from the stagecoach. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I'm good at finding things that don't want to be found, Miss Turner, though in your case, I reckon you very much wanted to be found. As night fell, bringing blessed coolness to the desert, Della drifted in and out of consciousness. Fever from her wound made her delirious at times, and she found herself confusing past and present. Once she woke with a start, crying out at imagined outlaws. Deacon was instantly beside her, his hand steady on her shoulder. You're safe, he said simply. I'm here. Those words, spoken in his deep, quiet voice, anchored her. Della reached out weakly and grasped his wrist. Don't leave, I won't. He settled beside her, his back against the mesquite trunk, rifle across his knees. Sleep now. Morning brought clarity as Della's fever broke during the night. She woke to find Deacon crouched by a small fire, cooking something that smelled better than anything she could remember. Coffee. He offered when he noticed her watching him. Please. Della tried to sit up and winced at the pain in her side. Easy there. Deacon was beside her in an instant, helping her to a sitting position and propping her against his rolled-up jacket. Bullet didn't hit anything vital, but you've lost blood and that infection was taking hold. You're lucky. Lucky, Della repeated with a bitter laugh that turned into a cough. 4 days ago, I was on my way to a new life in Tucson. Now I'm half dead in the desert with nothing but the clothes on my back. You're alive, Deacon pointed out as he handed her a battered tin cup of strong black coffee. That's more than can be said for the others. The reminder sobbed her. The Millers. They were going to start a mercantile in Tucson. And Mr. Gladstone, he was a banker, and poor Mr. Pierce. She trailed off, tears welling in her eyes. I just ran and left them. You'd be dead too if you hadn't, Deacon said bluntly. Nothing you could have done against armed men except what you did. You survived. Della sipped the coffee, letting its warmth and bitterness ground her in the present. How far are we from town? Wyatt's about 40 miles west. We'll start back today, but we'll need to take it slow. You can ride with me on Ajax. He nodded toward his horse, who was contentedly cropping at the sparse desert grass nearby. I can ride, Della insisted, attempting to project a strength she didn't feel. Deacon's expression made it clear he wasn't fooled. You can barely sit up, Miss Turner. We'll ride double, nice and easy. Should make the Cottonwood Creek by nightfall, then Wyatt by tomorrow evening. Too weak to argue further, Della nodded. After a simple breakfast of johnnycake and the last of the coffee, Deacon helped her to her feet. The world swam alarmingly, and she found herself leaning heavily against his solid frame. Sorry, she murmured, embarrassed by her weakness. Nothing to apologize for. His voice rumbled in his chest against her cheek. Desert takes a toll on the strongest of men, let alone a city lady with a bullet wound. I'm not a city lady, Della protested as he helped her toward the horse. I grew up in mining camps. My father was a prospector. Is that so? Deacon's tone suggested mild interest as he lifted her effortlessly onto his horse, then swung up behind her. One strong arm circled her waist to keep her steady as he gathered the reins with his free hand. Where at? All over. Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico. Della tried to sit straight, but as Ajax began to walk, the motion sent pain shooting through her side. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. Lean back, Deacon instructed. Use me for support. Long ride ahead. Reluctantly, Della allowed herself to rest against his chest. Despite her discomfort, she had to admit there was something reassuring about his solid presence behind her, his arm secure around her waist. For the first time in days, she felt safe. As they rode, Deacon kept up a steady stream of quiet conversation, something Della suspected was uncharacteristic for the taciturn tracker. He told her about Wyatt, a growing settlement named after the first settler, not the famous lawman, and about the people there. Doc Simmons, who was more veterinarian than physician but did his best for human patients, Mrs. Holloway, who ran the boarding house and made the best apple pie in the territory, Sheriff Holden, whose honesty was as reliable as his poor eyesight was not. And you? Della asked as they paused to rest the horse in the shade of a rock outcropping. How does a man with your skills end up in a place like Wyatt? Deacon passed her a canteen before answering. Got tired of wandering, wanted someplace to call my own. A pause. Folks in Wyatt don't much care that my mother was Mexican. Not all towns are so accepting. Della nodded, understanding all too well the prejudices that existed in frontier towns. And your ranch, you mentioned you have one. Small, spread about 3 miles outside town. 100 acres, mostly scrubland, but there's a good spring. Run about 40 head of cattle, nothing fancy. Sounds like heaven to me right now, Della admitted. A faint smile touched Deacon's lips. It's quiet, peaceful. He took the canteen back, his fingers brushing hers. We should keep moving if we want to make the creek by nightfall. True to his word, they reached Cottonwood Creek as the sun dipped below the horizon. The creek was little more than a trickle between rocky banks, but the cottonwoods that gave it its name provided welcome shade. Deacon helped Della dismount, easing her down gently when her legs threatened to buckle. You did well today, he said as he helped her sit with her back against a tree trunk. Most folks wouldn't have managed half so well after what you've been through. I had little choice in the matter, Della replied, though his praise warmed her more than it should. Deacon built a small fire and prepared a more substantial meal than the previous night, bacon and beans, with the last of the hardtack softened in the grease. As they ate, Della studied her rescuer in the firelight. He was younger than she'd initially thought, probably early 30s, with the weathered look of a man who lived outdoors. His features were strong, high cheekbones, straight nose, firm jaw, and his eyes, when they met hers, were a deep brown that reminded her of rich coffee. You're staring, Miss Turner, he observed without looking up from his plate. Della felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm trying to understand why a man would track a stranger for 3 days through desert that most people avoid entirely. Deacon set his plate aside and met her gaze directly. My father taught me that a man's character is defined by what he does when no one's watching. Most folks would have written you off as dead. Couldn't do that, not without knowing. Well, I'm grateful, Della's voice softened. I would have died out there without you. You showed remarkable determination. Most people would have given up much sooner. I've never been one to surrender easily. She smiled faintly. Father always said I was more stubborn than his mule. Good quality in these parts. Deacon stood and gathered their plates. You should rest. We've got another long day tomorrow. That night, Della slept better, wrapped in Deacon's bedroll while he kept watch by the fire. Her wound still throbbed, but the fever had passed, and she felt strength gradually returning to her limbs. In the quiet moments before sleep claimed her, she found herself watching Deacon's profile against the starlit sky and wondering what twist of fate had sent this particular man to her rescue. Morning came with the chattering of birds in the cottonwoods and the smell of coffee brewing. Della awoke to find Deacon already up and tending to Ajax. She managed to sit up without assistance, pleased to find her dizziness mostly gone. "There's coffee in the pot," Deacon called when he noticed her stirring, "and some jerky in my saddlebag if you're hungry." "Thank you." Della made her way carefully to the fire, moving slowly to avoid aggravating her wound. "How far to Wyatt from here?" "About 25 miles. Easier country than yesterday. Should make it by sunset if we don't push too hard." They set out after a simple breakfast, once again riding double on Ajax. Della found herself less embarrassed by the closeness today, her body naturally finding its place against Deacon's as they rode. The land gradually changed as they traveled west, the barren flats giving way to scattered saguaro cacti and occasional patches of grassland. "What will you do when we reach town?" Deacon asked after they'd ridden in comfortable silence for several hours. The question caught Della off guard. In truth, she hadn't thought beyond survival. "I don't know," she admitted. "Everything I owned was in my trunk on that stagecoach. I had plans to join my brother in Tucson, but I have no money for passage now." "Your brother know what happened?" "No, we weren't especially close. He left home when I was 14, headed west while father and I stayed in the mining camps." Della sighed. "He probably won't even notice if I don't arrive." Deacon was quiet for a moment. "Wyatt's a growing town, school's looking for a teacher. Previous one married a cattle baron from Texas and left last month." Della twisted to look up at him, surprised. "How did you know I was a teacher?" A slight smile touched his lips. "You speak like an educated woman. Figured you for a teacher or a preacher's daughter, and you said your father was a prospector." "I taught in Silver City for 3 years, Della confirmed. "It wasn't much of a school, just a room above the mercantile, but I enjoyed it. Town council would be interested to hear that. They've been advertising back east, but no takers yet. Frontier teaching doesn't appeal to many Eastern ladies." "I'm no Eastern lady," Della reminded him, earning a low chuckle that she felt rather than heard. "No, Miss Turner, you certainly are not." They reached the outskirts of Wyatt just as the sun began to set, painting the scattered buildings in hues of gold and amber. Despite its small size, the town appeared prosperous and well-ordered, with a wide main street, wooden sidewalks, and buildings constructed of both adobe and timber. People stopped to stare as Deacon rode in with Della before him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Deacon, you found her." Sheriff Holden hurried from the jailhouse, his weathered face breaking into a relieved smile. "Madam, we'd about given up hope. How is she, Deacon?" "Bullet wound to the side, but it's clean now. Dehydration exposure. She needs rest and proper care." Deacon dismounted and reached up to help Della down. "Doc Simmons is over at the saloon, setting Tom Weber's broken arm. I'll fetch him." The sheriff hurried off as a small crowd began to gather. "Let's get you settled somewhere quieter," Deacon suggested, noting Della's discomfort at being the center of attention. "Mrs. Holloway's boarding house is just down the street." Mrs. Holloway turned out to be a bustling woman in her 50s who took one look at Della and immediately began issuing orders. Within minutes, Della found herself installed in a clean, comfortable room with fresh water for washing and the promise of hot food to come. "You rest easy, dear Mrs. Holloway instructed. "Doc Simmons will be by directly to look at that wound, and I'll bring up some supper once you're settled." When they were alone, Della turned to Deacon, who stood awkwardly by the door. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "You saved my life." "Just did what needed doing." He shifted his weight, seeming uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Sheriff will want your statement about the robbery when you're stronger. Those men are still out there. Will you?" Della hesitated, suddenly reluctant to see him go. "Will you come back tomorrow?" "I'd like to hear more about that teaching position." Something flickered in his dark eyes, surprise, perhaps, or pleasure. "If you like, I'll speak to Mayor Thornton in the morning. He handles school matters." "Thank you, Mr. Xavier, for everything." Deacon touched the brim of his hat. "Rest well, Miss Turner." After he left, Della sank onto the bed, exhaustion claiming her now that she was truly safe. She'd lost everything she owned, narrowly escaped death, and found herself stranded in a town where she knew no one. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, it was not fear or uncertainty that filled her mind, but the memory of strong arms holding her steady and a quiet voice promising safety. The next week passed in a blur of recovery and adjustment. Doc Simmons, a gruff but competent physician, pronounced Della's wound healing well and prescribed rest and good food. Mrs. Holloway took Della under her wing, providing not only meals, but also lending her clothes and introducing her to the townspeople who streamed through the boarding house to meet the woman who'd survived the desert. True to his word, Deacon returned the day after their arrival, bringing Mayor Thornton with him. The mayor, a portly, enthusiastic man with mutton chop whiskers, was delighted to discover Della's teaching experience. "Miss Turner, you're a godsend," he declared. "Our school's been without a teacher for nearly 2 months. Children running wild, parents at their wits' end. When can you start?" "I don't have any of my teaching materials," Della stammered, overwhelmed by his enthusiasm. "Or appropriate clothing, for that matter. Trifles, mere trifles." The mayor waved dismissively. "Town will provide what you need to start. Salary's $30 a month plus room and board at Mrs. Holloway's, paid by the town council. What do you say?" Della glanced at Deacon, who stood quietly by the window, his expression unreadable. "I'd be honored to accept, Mayor Thornton," she said. "Once Doc Simmons clears me for work." "Wonderful. I'll inform the council immediately. School can reopen next Monday." With a tip of his hat, the mayor bustled out, already planning announcements and preparations. When they were alone, Della turned to Deacon. "You arranged this, didn't you?" He shrugged, the gesture neither confirming nor denying. "Town needs a teacher. You need a position. Seemed logical. Nevertheless, I'm grateful." Della studied him in the morning light that streamed through the window. He looked different in town, still rugged, but cleaner, his dark hair damp from washing, his jaw freshly shaven. He wore a simple white shirt with his denim trousers, and a string tie at his throat suggested concession to town proprieties. "Sheriff took my statement about the stagecoach robbery yesterday," he said, changing the subject. "Posse is still tracking those outlaws. They've hit 2 other stages in the past month. Do they know who they are?" Leader goes by Rance Caldwell. "Used to ride with the Barton gang until they were caught 3 years back. He escaped the hanging and formed his own outfit." Deacon's expression darkened. "They'll catch him eventually." "Men like that always make mistakes." Della shuddered, remembering Caldwell's cold eyes as he ordered the executions. "I hope so." "How are you feeling today?" Deacon asked, his tone softening. "Better. Doc says I can start moving around more, maybe even take short walks." Della smiled. "Mrs. Holloway says I'm gaining back the weight I lost in the desert, thanks to her cooking." "Good." Deacon seemed about to say more, but instead moved toward the door. "I should let you rest." "Wait." Della's voice stopped him. Would you walk with me later?" "Doc said I should start with short distances, but I don't know the town yet." Deacon hesitated, then nodded. "I'll come by after I finish at the livery, around 4. I'll be ready." True to his word, Deacon returned that afternoon. The walk was brief, just down the main street and back, but it gave Della her first real look at Wyatt. Despite its frontier location, the town showed signs of prosperity and permanence. A proper church stood at one end of the street, its white steeple gleaming in the sun. The schoolhouse, which would soon be her domain, was a sturdy building near the center of town. Various businesses, a general store, a barber shop, a dressmaker's, and of course the saloon lined the street, along with a handful of private residences. "It's a nice town," Della observed as they walked slowly back toward the boarding house. "Newer than I expected. Founded in '69, Deacon said. Started as a way station on the Tucson Road, grew when they found silver in the foothills. Not a big strike, but enough to bring folks in. Now it's mostly ranching and some farming where the creek provides water." "And your ranch, you mentioned it was outside town, 3 miles north. Built the house myself 2 years back. Nothing fancy, but it's solid. Good water from a spring, enough grazing for my small herd." "I'd like to see it sometime," Della said, then blushed at her forwardness. Deacon looked surprised but not displeased. "Maybe when you're stronger." Their walks became a daily ritual as Della regained her strength. Each afternoon, Deacon would appear at the boarding house, and they would venture a little farther into town. He was not a talkative man by nature, but he answered her questions about Wyatt and its inhabitants, gradually revealing more about himself as well. She learned that he'd scouted for the army during the Apache conflicts, that he could speak 3 languages: English, Spanish, and enough Apache to get by. He told her about building his ranch, about breaking Ajax from a wild Mustang herd, about the books he read during long winter evenings, history and philosophy, mostly ordered from catalogs and delivered on the same stagecoaches he sometimes tracked. In turn, Della told him about her childhood following her father from one mining camp to another, about teaching herself to read from her mother's Bible after her mother died of pneumonia, about the teacher in Virginia City who'd recognized her intelligence and arranged for her proper education. "Never expected to find myself teaching," she admitted as they sat on a bench outside the general store watching the town's afternoon activities. "But when Father died and the claim played out, I needed work. The school in Silver City was looking for a teacher, and I had more education than most in those parts." "You enjoy it, teaching, very much," Della smiled, thinking of her former pupils. "There's something wonderful about watching a child's mind open to new ideas." "Even the most reluctant learners have moments when their eyes light up with understanding." Deacon nodded thoughtfully. "My mother taught me to read. Father was often away with his regiment, so she made sure I had education." A faint smile touched his lips. "She'd be pleased to know I still read regularly. She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. His expression grew distant. "Lost them both to fever when I was 17. Army doctor tried, but medicine was in short supply at the outpost." Impulsively, Della placed her hand over his where it rested on the bench between them. "I'm sorry." Deacon looked down at their hands, then turned his palm up to clasp hers briefly. "Long time ago now." The gesture, simple as it was, sent warmth spreading through Della's chest. In the days since her rescue, she'd found herself increasingly drawn to the quiet tracker. He was unlike any man she'd known before: thoughtful, direct, competent in all he did. His physical presence affected her in ways that were both unfamiliar and not entirely unwelcome. Monday arrived, and with it, Della's first day as Wyatt's schoolteacher. The school building was a single large room with rows of wooden desks facing a teacher's desk on a small raised platform. Bookshelves lined one wall, sparsely filled with readers and primers. A pot-bellied stove stood ready for winter, and large windows provided natural light. Mayor Thornton had been as good as his word. New slates and chalk awaited each student, and a set of McGuffey readers had been ordered from Tucson. The town's women had rallied to provide Della with appropriate clothing, 2 serviceable dresses for teaching, and the promise of more once the dressmaker finished alterations. 27 students appeared that morning, ranging in age from 6 to 16. They eyed their new teacher with curiosity as she called them to order. Most were children of ranchers or townspeople, though a few Mexican children from nearby farms were among them. "Good morning," Della began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I'm Miss Turner, and I'll be your teacher. I know you've been without instruction for some time, so we'll begin by determining where each of you stands in your studies." The day passed in a whirl of assessments and introductions. By afternoon, Della had a clear picture of the educational needs before her. The youngest children needed basic reading and numbers, while the older ones had a patchwork of knowledge that needed structure and expansion. Despite the challenges, she found herself energized by the work, falling easily back into the rhythms of teaching. As she dismissed the class at day's end, she was surprised to see Deacon waiting outside. He stood a little apart from the waiting mothers, his tall figure distinctive even at a distance. "Mr. Xavier," she greeted him as the last child departed, "what brings you to town today?" "Thought you might like to see something, if you're not too tired from your first day." His expression gave little away, but there was a hint of anticipation in his eyes. "I'd like that very much," Della replied, curiosity piqued. "Let me gather my things." He led her to where Ajax waited patiently, then surprised her by producing a gentle mare from the livery stable. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned you know how to ride," he explained. "Thought you might prefer your own mount instead of riding double now that you're stronger." Della stroked the mare's velvety nose, pleased by his thoughtfulness. "She's lovely. What's her name?" "Mariposa." She belongs to the livery, but Jennings says you can use her whenever you like. With Deacon's help, Della mounted, grateful that Mrs. Holloway had lent her a divided riding skirt. They set off at an easy pace, heading north out of town along a well-worn trail. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as they rode, the air cooling as evening approached. "Where are we going?" Della asked after they'd been riding for about 20 minutes. "My place," Deacon replied simply. "Thought you might like to see it. Don't have to if you'd rather go back to town." "No, I'd like to see it," Della assured him, touched by the invitation. She sensed it wasn't one he extended lightly. Another 10 minutes of riding brought them to a narrow valley where a small but well-built cabin stood near a cluster of cottonwood trees. A corral and barn stood nearby, and a small herd of cattle grazed on the hillside beyond. A garden plot beside the cabin showed neat rows of vegetables, and a stream sparkled in the late afternoon sun as it wound past the property. "It's beautiful," Della said softly as they approached. Deacon's expression relaxed into something close to pride as he helped her dismount. "Not much, but it's mine. Built most of it myself." He showed her around the property, the barn with its tack room and storage for winter feed, the smokehouse where he preserved meat, the chicken coop that provided eggs and occasional Sunday dinner. The cabin itself was simple but surprisingly comfortable, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area and a smaller bedroom visible through a partially open door. What struck Della most was the care evident in everything. The furniture, though plain, was well crafted. Bookshelves held the volumes he'd mentioned, arranged by subject. Copper pots hung in the kitchen area gleamed from regular polishing. It was a bachelor's home, certainly, but one maintained with pride and attention to detail. "You've created something special here," she said as they stood on the porch, watching the sun begin to set behind the western hills. "Been working toward it most of my life," Deacon admitted. "Always wanted a place that was mine, where I belonged. And do you belong here?" He considered the question seriously. "Most days. Still times when I feel the pull to move on, track something, find what's over the next ridge, but those times come less often now." Della nodded, understanding. "I've never stayed anywhere longer than 3 years. Always moving to the next camp, the next opportunity. It would be nice to put down roots somewhere." "Wyatt could be that place," Deacon suggested, his voice careful, neutral. "Town's growing, school needs permanence." "Perhaps it could," Della agreed, meeting his gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, a possibility neither was quite ready to name. The moment was interrupted by the distant lowing of cattle. "Should head back," Deacon said reluctantly. "Don't want you riding after dark, not while you're still healing." As they rode back to town in the gathering twilight, Della found herself imagining what it would be like to stay in Wyatt permanently, to build a life in this frontier community. For the first time since the stagecoach robbery, she felt something beyond the simple gratitude of survival, a tentative hope for what might lie ahead. The weeks that followed fell into a pleasant pattern. Della taught during the day, gradually bringing structure and progress to the school. In the evenings, she often walked with Deacon when he came to town, or occasionally rode out to his ranch on Sundays after church. Their friendship deepened, conversations coming more easily as they grew comfortable with each other. Della became a part of Wyatt's community as well, attending socials at the church, taking meals with different families who wanted to welcome their new teacher, helping with the town's preparations for the upcoming harvest festival. She found herself welcomed and valued in a way she hadn't experienced before. One evening in late September, nearly 2 months after her rescue, Della sat on the boarding house porch with Mrs. Holloway, enjoying the cooler air that came with autumn. "You've brought that school back to life, Mrs. Holloway remarked as she worked on her knitting. "My granddaughter Hannah talks of nothing but her lessons now. Yesterday she was explaining the rivers of Europe to her little brother as if she'd seen them herself." Della smiled, warmed by the praise. "The children are eager to learn." "Makes my job a pleasure." Mrs. Holloway's needles clicked steadily for a moment before she spoke again. "You know, Deacon Xavier's never been one for socializing, keeps to himself mostly, comes to town only when necessary." She glanced sideways at Della. "Until recently, that is." Della felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mr. Xavier has been kind enough to show me around the area. He did save my life after all. Indeed he did." Mrs. Holloway's smile turned knowing. "And now he's in town nearly every day, looking more presentable than I've seen him in 5 years. Even bought a new shirt from Jensen's store last week." "Mrs. Holloway, are you implying—" "I'm not implying anything, dear. Merely observing that a confirmed bachelor suddenly finding reasons to come to town is the sort of thing people notice in a small community like ours." She patted Della's hand. "And approve of, I might add." Before Della could formulate a response, the subject of their conversation appeared at the gate. Deacon wore the new shirt Mrs. Holloway had mentioned, dark blue cotton that complemented his tanned skin and dark hair. He'd trimmed his beard as well, she noticed. "Evening, ladies," he greeted them, removing his hat. "Miss Turner, I was wondering if you might like to attend the Harvest Festival dance with me on Saturday, if you don't already have plans." The invitation, delivered with Deacon's characteristic directness, left Della momentarily speechless. Mrs. Holloway, however, had no such difficulty. "What a lovely invitation," she exclaimed. "Della was just saying she hoped to attend but hadn't yet been asked." "I was." Della gave her landlady a bemused look before turning back to Deacon. "I'd be honored to attend with you, Mr. Xavier." "Good." He nodded, seeming pleased but unsurprised, as if he'd never doubted her acceptance. "I'll call for you at 7, after he left Mrs. Holloway resumed her knitting with a satisfied smile. "Like I said, people notice these things." The Harvest Festival was Wyatt's largest annual celebration, marking the end of the growing season and bringing together townsfolk and neighboring ranchers for a day of contests, food, and socializing. The schoolyard had been transformed with lanterns and bunting, tables laden with dishes contributed by the town's women, and a cleared area for dancing. Della spent the day helping with preparations and supervising children's games. As evening approached, she returned to the boarding house to prepare for the dance. Bathing in the luxury of hot water, Mrs. Holloway had heated and selecting her best dress, a deep green calico with lace trim at the collar and cuffs. Mrs. Ellsworth from the dressmaker's shop had helped alter it to fit Della's recovered figure, taking in the waist that had grown too large during her desert ordeal. Della arranged her honey blonde hair in a simple but elegant style, securing it with tortoiseshell combs borrowed from Mrs. Holloway. When Deacon arrived to escort her, his appreciative gaze made her blush. He too had made an effort with his appearance, wearing not only the new shirt but also a proper suit coat that, while not new, had been well brushed and pressed. "You look beautiful, Miss Turner," he said simply. "Thank you." "You're quite handsome yourself, Mr. Xavier." He offered his arm with a formality that seemed both unfamiliar and endearing. "Shall we?" The dance was already underway when they arrived, fiddle music spilling out into the evening air along with laughter and conversation. Couples twirled on the makeshift dance floor while others visited at the surrounding tables. All activity seemed to pause briefly as Deacon and Della entered together, curious glances and knowing smiles following their progress. "People are staring," Della murmured, suddenly self-conscious. "Let them," Deacon replied, his hand warm on the small of her back as he guided her toward the refreshment table. "It's not every day they see the town's most educated lady with a rough rancher." "You're hardly rough," Della protested. "I've seen your bookshelves, remember." A smile touched his lips. Books don't change where a man comes from or how others see him. Before Della could respond, Mayor Thornton approached, beaming widely. "Miss Turner, Mr. Xavier, delighted you could join our celebration." "Miss Turner, the school display is receiving tremendous praise. Parents are most impressed with their children's progress." "Thank you, Mayor. The students deserve the credit for their hard work." "Nonsense. A good teacher makes all the difference." The mayor turned to Deacon. "And Mr. Xavier, the beef you provided for the barbecue was excellent." "Everyone's commenting on it." Deacon acknowledged the praise with a nod. "Good feed makes good beef, Mayor." After the mayor moved on to greet other arrivals, Deacon and Della circulated through the gathering. Della was greeted warmly by parents and students, while Deacon exchanged words with fellow ranchers and townsmen he did business with. Though not demonstrative, Deacon remained close to Della throughout, his hand occasionally returning to the small of her back as they moved through the crowd. When the band struck up a waltz, Deacon turned to her. "Would you care to dance, Miss Turner?" "I'd like that," Della replied, though she felt suddenly nervous. "I should warn you, it's been some time since I've danced. Makes two of us." His mouth curved in a half-smile as he led her to the dance floor. Despite their mutual rustiness, they moved well together. Deacon was surprisingly graceful for such a tall man, and Della followed his lead easily. As they circled the floor, Della gradually relaxed, enjoying the simple pleasure of being held in his arms, even in the formal frame of a waltz. "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked as they turned past the band. "Army posts had socials. My mother insisted I learn properly." His expression softened at the memory. Said no son of hers would shuffle around a dance floor like an untrained bear. Della laughed. "She sounds wonderful." "She would have liked you," Deacon said quietly, his dark eyes holding hers. The simple statement, delivered with such certainty, touched Della deeply. As the music ended, she found herself reluctant to step away from him. They danced twice more that evening, but spent most of their time talking with townspeople or sitting together at one of the small tables that bordered the dance floor. As the night progressed, Della noticed that Deacon seemed increasingly preoccupied, his gaze often distant despite his attentiveness to her. "Is something wrong?" she finally asked as they walked back toward the boarding house at evening's end, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Deacon was silent for several steps before responding. "Sheriff got word today. Rance Caldwell's gang was spotted near the Dragoon Mountains. Posse is heading out tomorrow to join forces with the Tombstone lawmen." Della felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Are you going with them?" "Sheriff asked me to. Need a tracker who knows that country." He glanced down at her, his expression grave. "Told him I'd give him my answer in the morning. I see." Della tried to keep her voice steady, but fear welled up, unbidden fear, not only for Deacon's safety if he went, but also fear of the memories that news of Caldwell brought rushing back. They walked in silence until they reached the boarding house gate. Instead of opening it, Deacon turned to face her, his expression troubled in the moonlight. "Della." It was the first time he'd used her given name. "I don't want to go, but those men killed 4 people and left you to die. They've killed others since. They need to be stopped." "I know." She looked up at him, conflict evident in her expression. "You're right, they should be brought to justice, but—" She hesitated, then forced herself to continue. "The thought of you facing them terrifies me." Deacon's hand came up to cup her cheek, the calluses on his palm rough against her skin. "I've tracked men like Caldwell before. I'm careful. That doesn't make it less dangerous." Della covered his hand with her own, holding it against her face. "I've lost too many people in my life, Deacon. I couldn't bear—" She stopped, suddenly aware of how much she was revealing. Something changed in Deacon's gaze, a warming, a certainty. "Della," he said softly, then leaned down to kiss her. The kiss was gentle at first, almost questioning, but when Della responded, it deepened with a hunger that surprised them both. His arms went around her, drawing her close against him as her hands slid up to his shoulders. In that moment, everything else fell away: the boarding house, the town, the threat of Caldwell's gang. There was only Deacon's solid warmth and the rightness of being in his arms. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Deacon rested his forehead against hers. "Been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "Why didn't you?" Della asked, her hands still on his shoulders, unwilling to let go. "Wasn't sure you'd welcome it. You're educated, refined. Could have your pick of men more suitable than a half-Mexican ex-bounty hunter." "There is no one more suitable," Della said firmly. "No one braver or kinder or more honorable." Deacon kissed her again, briefly but with feeling. "I'll go with the posse," he said when they parted. "But I'll come back to you. That's a promise." "I'll hold you to it," Della whispered, trying to memorize the contours of his face in the moonlight, afraid despite his assurances. The next morning, Della stood with a small crowd of townsfolk as the posse prepared to ride out. 8 men in total: Sheriff Holden, Deacon, and 6 others, all armed and provisioned for what might be an extended pursuit. Deacon's expression was focused, distant, the tracker preparing for the hunt, but his eyes softened when they met hers. He swung down from his saddle for a moment to speak with her apart from the others. "I've written some things down," he said quietly, pressing a folded paper into her hand. Ranch deed, bank account, where to find things, just in case. Don't, Della protested, her throat tight. Need to be practical. His hand closed over hers, warm and steady. But I mean to come back, Della, don't doubt that. I'll be waiting, she promised, fighting tears. Be careful. He kissed her once, quickly but publicly, before remounting a declaration to the watching town that left no doubt about his intentions. Then, with a nod to the sheriff, he rode out with the posse, his tall figure straight and resolute in the saddle. The days that followed were among the hardest Della had endured, in some ways worse than her time lost in the desert. Then, she had been focused entirely on survival, on the next step, the next breath. Now, she had to continue with normal life, teaching, attending church, participating in town activities, all while fear for Deacon gnawed at her constantly. Sporadic news reached Wyatt through telegraph messages or travelers passing through. The posse had joined forces with lawmen from Tombstone and Bisbee. They'd found Caldwell's trail leading into the mountains. A shootout had occurred at an abandoned mining camp, with one outlaw killed and another captured, but Caldwell and 3 others had escaped. 2 weeks after their departure, word came that they were closing in on the remaining outlaws near the Mexican border. Della found herself unable to sleep, pacing the floor of her room late into the night, praying for Deacon's safe return. It was Mrs. Holloway who brought the news on the 17th day. Della, dear, she called, hurrying up the stairs to Della's classroom after school had dismissed. They're back. The posse is coming in now. Della's heart leapt. She hastily gathered her things and followed Mrs. Holloway outside, where townspeople were already gathering in the street. The posse rode in slowly, dust-covered and weary. Sheriff Holden led the way, followed by 5 riders. 5, not 7. Cold fear washed over Della as she scanned the returning men. Deacon wasn't among them. Sheriff Holden dismounted stiffly, his face grim as he approached Mayor Thornton. Della pushed forward, unable to wait for official announcements. Sheriff, she called, her voice tight with fear. Where's Deacon? The sheriff turned to her, removing his hat. Miss Turner. Mr. Xavier was wounded during the final confrontation with Caldwell. He insisted on taking a different route back, said he'd make his own way. Wounded? How badly? Della demanded, her heart pounding. Took a bullet in the shoulder. Doc Patterson in Tombstone patched him up, said it wasn't too serious, but Xavier lost blood and needed rest. The sheriff shook his head. Stubborn man wouldn't stay put, said he had a promise to keep and would get back his own way. How long ago was this? Where was he last seen? Della's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. A wounded man traveling alone through hostile territory, 3 days ago near the Dragoon foothills. He headed north while we continued to Bisbee with the prisoners. The sheriff's expression softened. Miss Turner, Xavier knows that country better than anyone. If he said he'd make it back, I believe him. Della nodded numbly, then turned and walked quickly away, needing to be alone with her fears. She found herself heading toward the livery stable without conscious decision. Miss Turner. Sam Jennings, the livery owner, looked up in surprise as she entered. Something I can help you with. I need to borrow Mariposa, Della said, her voice steadier than she felt. And supplies for a 2-day ride. Jennings frowned. Heard the posse is back, but Xavier isn't with them. You thinking of going looking for him? Yes. The liveryman scratched his beard thoughtfully. No offense, miss, but that's rough country between here and the Dragoons. Not safe for a woman alone. Mr. Jennings, Della said firmly, that man tracked me for 3 days through Perdition Flats when everyone else had given me up for dead. I won't do less for him. Something in her expression must have conveyed her determination, because Jennings sighed and nodded. All right. But you take plenty of water and a good rifle, and you tell folks where you're headed. An hour later, Della rode out of town, headed south toward the Dragoon Mountains. She wore the divided riding skirt Mrs. Holloway had given her and a man's cotton shirt borrowed from the general store. A wide-brimmed hat shaded her face, and saddlebags held provisions for 3 days. Strapped to her saddle was a Winchester rifle that Jennings had insisted she take. She had basic tracking skills from her years in mining camps, where getting lost could mean death. More importantly, she knew Deacon. If he was making his way back to Wyatt, he would take the most direct route his condition allowed, avoiding settlements where questions might be asked about a wounded man traveling alone. Della rode until dusk, making good progress on the main trail south. She made camp in a small hollow with good visibility, building only a small fire for coffee before extinguishing it completely. Sleep came fitfully, her mind too full of worry to rest properly. At first light, she continued south, watching for any sign of a rider coming from the direction of the dragoons. By mid-morning, she'd reached a fork in the trail. The main path continued southeast toward the mountains, while a lesser-used track branched westward toward a line of hills. Della hesitated, studying the terrain. The main trail was easier traveling but more frequented by travelers. The western track was rougher but provided more cover and water sources, the route a wounded man might choose to avoid unwanted encounters. "Which way would you go, Deacon?" She murmured, scanning the horizon. Decision made, she turned Mariposa onto the western track. The path narrowed as it wound through increasingly rocky terrain, forcing her to slow their pace. By early afternoon, the heat had become intense, and Della stopped in the shade of a rocky outcropping to rest and water the horse. As she sipped from her canteen, movement in the distance caught her eye, a dark shape moving slowly along the trail ahead. Returning the canteen to her saddlebag, Della mounted quickly and urged Mariposa forward, hope and fear warring in her chest. As the distance closed, the shape resolved into a rider on horseback, slumped forward in the saddle. Even at this distance, she recognized Ajax's distinctive dun coloring and the set of the rider's shoulders, despite their uncharacteristic stoop. "Deacon," she called, urging Mariposa into a canter. The rider straightened slightly, turning in her direction. Even from 100 yards away, she could see his exhaustion in the way he held himself. One arm was bound against his chest with a makeshift sling. Della reached him moments later, reining Mariposa alongside Ajax. Deacon looked terrible, face pale beneath his tan, several days' worth of beard darkening his jaw, his shirt stained with blood both fresh and dried. But his eyes brightened when they focused on her. "Della," he rasped, as if not quite believing what he saw. "What are you doing out here?" "Looking for you, you stubborn man," she replied, tears of relief threatening to spill. "The posse returned without you. Told Holden I'd make my own way back." Deacon winced as he shifted in the saddle. "Didn't expect to meet you halfway." "You're bleeding again," Della observed, noticing the fresh stains on his makeshift bandage. "We need to stop and tend to that wound." Deacon didn't argue, a sign of how weak he truly was. Della led them to a nearby stand of trees that offered shade and some protection from the wind. With practiced efficiency, she helped him dismount and settle against a tree trunk, then saw to the horses before turning her attention to his injury. "Let me see," she said gently, kneeling beside him and helping him remove the sling and bloodied shirt. The wound was an angry red furrow across his left shoulder, recently reopened and seeping blood. Doc Patterson's stitches had held in places but torn in others, where movement had stressed them. "Caught me as I was taking aim at Caldwell," Deacon explained, watching as she cleaned the wound with water from her canteen. "Still managed to put a bullet in him. He won't be robbing any more stagecoaches." "You killed him?" Della asked, hands stilling momentarily. "No. Wounded him bad enough for the others to capture him." Deacon's expression hardened. "He'll hang for what he did. Justice for those people on the stagecoach, for what he tried to do to you." Della nodded, resuming her careful cleaning of the wound. "I'm glad. Not for the hanging, but for the justice." She reached into her saddlebag for the medical supplies she'd brought. "This will hurt." Deacon barely flinched as she cleaned the wound with whiskey and rebandaged it with clean cloth. When she finished, he caught her hand in his. "Thank you," he said simply, "for coming after me." "Did you think I wouldn't?" Della asked, her voice soft but steady. "You tracked me through Perdition Flats when everyone else thought I was dead. This was the least I could do." Still, his fingers tightened around hers. "Means everything that you came." They camped there for the night, Della insisting that Deacon needed rest before continuing to Wyatt. She prepared a simple meal from her provisions and made him drink plenty of water, watching with concern as he struggled to stay awake. "Sleep," she urged, spreading her blanket over him as the evening cooled. "I'll keep watch," Not right, he protested weakly. You shouldn't have to. Sleep, Deacon, she repeated firmly. We'll reach town tomorrow and Doc Simmons can properly tend that wound. He complied, exhaustion finally claiming him. Della sat beside him, rifle across her knees, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Occasionally, she would glance at Deacon's sleeping face, reassuring herself with the steady rise and fall of his chest. Around midnight, he stirred, mumbling in his sleep. Della leaned closer to catch his words. Della, he murmured, restless with fever. Have to get back, promised? SHH, she soothed, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. I'm here, you kept your promise. His eyes opened briefly, fever bright in the moonlight. Love you, he whispered before slipping back into sleep. Della's heart swelled at the words, even knowing they might be fever-induced. I love you too, she whispered back, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. Morning brought improvement. Deacon's fever had broken during the night, and though weak, he was clear-headed and determined to reach Wyatt. Della rebandaged his wound, relieved to see no fresh bleeding, and helped him mount Ajax. They rode at a careful pace, Della keeping close watch on Deacon for signs of weakening. He remained stubbornly upright in the saddle, though she could see the effort it cost him. We're quite a pair, aren't we? She observed as they paused to rest the horses at midday. First you rescuing me half dead from the desert, now me finding you bleeding in the hills. A smile touched Deacon's lips. Seems we're good at finding each other when it matters. By late afternoon, the familiar buildings of Wyatt appeared on the horizon. Della felt relief wash over her at the sight, knowing that proper medical attention for Deacon was now within reach. As they rode down the main street, townspeople emerged from shops and homes, word of their approach spreading quickly. Doc Simmons was waiting at the door of his office as they arrived. Bring him in here, he ordered, helping Della assist Deacon from his saddle. The next hour passed in a blur as the doctor cleaned and properly stitched Deacon's wound, administered laudanum for the pain, and issued stern instructions about rest and recovery. Mrs. Holloway appeared, clucking with concern and insisting that Deacon stay at the boarding house until he was well enough to return to his ranch. Absolutely not, Deacon protested, fighting the effects of the laudanum. I'll recover at my own place. Don't be ridiculous, Mrs. Holloway replied. You can't properly tend yourself with that shoulder, and your ranch is 3 miles out of town. What if the wound fevers? I'll stay with him, Della said quietly. Both Mrs. Holloway and Deacon looked at her in surprise. At his ranch, Della clarified, her chin lifting slightly. I can tend his wound, see that he rests, and ensure he has proper meals. She turned to Mrs. Holloway. If someone could take my classes for a few days, just until he's stable. Mrs. Holloway's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. My dear, while I applaud your dedication to Mr. Xavier's recovery, propriety must be considered. A single woman staying alone with a bachelor will marry first, Deacon interrupted, his voice gravelly but determined. Della's eyes widened. Deacon was planning to ask anyway once Caldwell was caught. His dark eyes held her steadily despite the laudanum. Bought a ring in Tombstone before we rode out. It's in my saddlebag. He glanced at Mrs. Holloway. With your permission, madam, I'd like a moment alone with Miss Turner, Mrs. Holloway looked between them, her expression softening. Well, I'll just step outside then. She departed, closing the door behind her. Deacon struggled to sit up straighter on the examination table. Not how I planned this, he admitted. Wanted to do it properly. Deacon, you're injured and under the influence of laudanum, Della said gently. We don't need to, Della. He reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong despite his weakness. I've known since I found you under that mesquite tree. Some things a man just knows. His eyes never left hers. I love you, want to build a life with you. Marry me, tears welled in Della's eyes. I love you too, she whispered. But are you certain? It's so soon and you're more certain of this than anything in my life, he said firmly. Say yes. Della's heart filled with a joy she hadn't dared to hope for. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. Deacon's smile transformed his tired face. Ajax's left saddlebag, he said, small pouch in the inside pocket. Della found the pouch exactly where he described and returned to his side, opening it to reveal a simple but beautiful gold ring set with a small sapphire. It's lovely, she breathed. Matches your eyes, Deacon said as he took it from her and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Belonged to my mother. Father gave it to me before he died, said to give it to the woman I couldn't live without. His eyes held hers. That's you. Della leaned down to kiss him gently. I couldn't bear to lose you either, she whispered against his lips. Not ever. 3 days later, they were married in Wyatt's small church. The ceremony was simple. Deacon, still weak from his wound, supported by Sheriff Holden as his best man, and Della radiant in a cream-colored dress hastily altered by Mrs. Ellsworth. The entire town attended, delighted by the romance of their schoolteacher marrying the man who had rescued her from certain death. Reverend Collins kept the service brief, acknowledging the unusual circumstances with good humor. Rarely have I seen two people more clearly meant for each other, he said, as he pronounced them husband and wife. Though the Lord does seem to have tested that bond through fire and bullet before bringing you to this altar. Deacon's kiss was gentle but thorough, prompting cheers and a few good-natured whistles from the congregation. Della blushed, but couldn't stop smiling as they made their way down the aisle as husband and wife. A brief reception followed at the boarding house, where Mrs. Holloway had prepared refreshments, and Mayor Thornton gave a somewhat rambling but heartfelt toast to the newlyweds. When Deacon began to tire, Della firmly announced their departure, and Sheriff Holden drove them in his buggy to Deacon's now their ranch. Home, Deacon said simply as he helped Della down from the buggy. She looked at the small cabin with new eyes, not as a visitor now, but as its mistress. Home, she agreed, squeezing his hand. The days that followed established a rhythm to their new life together. Della cared for Deacon as his wound healed, learning the routines of the ranch and adding her own touches to the cabin. A proper vegetable garden took shape behind the house. Curtains appeared at windows that had been bare, and Della's books joined Deacon's on the shelves. As Deacon regained his strength, he taught Della about the cattle, about the land and its seasons, about the quiet satisfaction of working one's own property. In turn, she brought music and laughter to rooms that had known only solitude, reading aloud in the evenings or playing the small piano Mayor Thornton had given them as a wedding gift. By Christmas, Deacon was fully recovered, and Della had returned to teaching, riding Mariposa to and from town each day. They hosted Christmas dinner at the ranch for Mrs. Holloway, Sheriff Holden, and several other friends from town, the cabin warm with firelight and rich with the scent of roasting turkey and Della's apple pies. Never thought I'd see the day, Sheriff Holden remarked to Deacon as they stood on the porch after dinner, watching the winter sunset. You, a married man with a proper home and a pretty wife. Deacon's gaze sought Della through the window, where she was showing Mrs. Holloway the quilt she'd begun making. Luckiest day of my life was when that stagecoach was robbed, he said quietly. The sheriff raised his eyebrows. That's a strange way to look at it. Brought her to Wyatt, brought her to me. Deacon shrugged. Call it fate or providence or just plain luck, but I'm grateful for it. Spring brought new life to the ranch, calves in the pasture, shoots in the garden, wildflowers covering the hillsides. It also brought news that completed their joy, Deacon. Della's voice called him in from the corral one April evening, her tone carrying an unusual excitement. He found her standing in the doorway of their cabin, her face alight with a radiance he'd never seen before. What is it? He asked, immediately concerned by her heightened color. Are you feeling unwell? Not unwell, she said, taking his hands in hers. Just different. She guided his palm to rest against her still flat stomach. Doc Simmons confirmed it today. We're going to have a baby in November. Joy like he'd never known surged through Deacon. He lifted Della in his arms, spinning her in a circle as she laughed. A baby, he repeated, setting her down gently. Our baby. Are you pleased? She asked, though his reaction had left little doubt. In answer, he kissed her deeply. More than I can say, he murmured against her lips. Never thought I'd have this, a wife, a child, a family of my own. Nor I, Della admitted, nestling against him. After years of wandering, I've finally found where I belong. As summer turned to fall, Della's body rounded with their child. She continued teaching until October, when the town council insisted she take leave earlier than planned. The women of Wyatt showered her with baby clothes and blankets, while Deacon spent his evenings crafting a cradle from cottonwood harvested on their land. On a crisp November night, with the first dusting of snow on the distant mountains, their son was born. Doc Simmons pronounced him perfect, strong lungs, good color, all fingers and toes accounted for, before handing the swaddled infant to an awestruck Deacon. "Samuel," Della suggested softly from the bed, watching her husband cradle their newborn with hands that could track a man across 100 miles of desert, yet were infinitely gentle with this tiny life. "After your father." "Samuel Turner Xavier," Deacon agreed, his voice rough with emotion as he carefully placed their son in Della's arms. "He's beautiful, like his mother." Della smiled up at him, exhausted but radiant. "He has your eyes, I think. And your determination. He certainly wasn't going to wait until morning to join us." Deacon sat beside them on the bed, one arm around Della's shoulders, the other hand lightly touching their son's dark hair. "Thank you," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her temple. "For what? For surviving. For being too stubborn to die in that desert, for finding me when I was lost." He met her gaze, his eyes suspiciously bright. "For everything." Years passed, and the Xavier family grew along with their ranch. Samuel was joined by a sister, Maria, 2 years later, and eventually by another brother, John. Deacon expanded their holdings to 300 acres and built a larger home to accommodate their growing family. Della continued teaching until her third pregnancy, then devoted herself to the ranch and children, though she still substituted at the school when needed. Wyatt grew as well, the railroad arriving in 1884 and bringing new prosperity to the town. The school expanded to 2 rooms, then 3. The Xaviers were respected members of the community, their unusual beginning now the stuff of local legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations. On their 10th anniversary, Deacon took Della riding to the exact spot in Perdition Flats where he had found her all those years ago. The stunted mesquite tree was still there, though the desert had long since erased any other sign of that desperate day. "Strange to think how close I came to dying here," Della remarked as they dismounted. "If you hadn't been so determined to find me." "And if you hadn't been so determined to live," Deacon added, taking her hand. "That's what struck me when I found you. Most people would have given up, but you just kept going." Della smiled up at him, her face still beautiful at 34, though marked now with fine lines around her eyes and mouth lines of laughter, of life fully lived. "We're well matched that way. Neither of us knows when to quit. Good thing, too." Deacon drew her into his arms. 10 years, 3 children, and I've never once regretted a single day of it." "Nor have I," Della assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Though I'm rather glad we won't be spending tonight in the desert." Deacon laughed, the sound free and easy in a way it hadn't been when they first met. "I've made reservations at that new hotel in Tucson. The children are staying with Mrs. Holloway. We have 3 whole days to ourselves." 3 days, Della mused, her eyes twinkling. "The same amount of time you tracked me. Perhaps I should make you work a bit to find me in that big hotel." "I'd find you anywhere, Della Xavier," Deacon promised, his voice deepening. "In desert or mountain, in this life or the next, some things a tracker never forgets." "And I'll always be waiting," Della replied softly, "knowing you'll come for me." They rode back toward Wyatt, as the setting sun painted the desert in shades of gold and amber, the same desert that had nearly claimed Della's life, now beautiful and familiar beneath a vast sky. Behind them, the empty flats stretched to the horizon. Ahead, the lights of their town began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, beckoning them home.